Hello, this is Lisa Harrison, and today I'm speaking with Michael Tsarion. Michael is an author and public speaker on subjects like astrology, mythology, religion, symbolism, conspiracy. He's written books. He's written books on Atlantis. Actually, the list goes on. So, welcome, Michael.
Oh, nice to be on, Lisa. Thank you.
You're on the verge of an Australian tour as well. We've just had David Icke here, and in fact, I think he's leaving the country today. And you arrive, your tour starts on the 19th of November in Melbourne. So, Australians are feeling a little bit spoiled at the moment. We're getting some great people coming out here at the moment. It's wonderful. Now, it feels to me, and what I've come to sort of believe, is that we are actually living in a world and a society, at least those of us in the West, that is actually built on occult principles. That the occult subjects, like I mentioned earlier, are actually behind the systems that we live in. They're the, how can I put it? They're, even the buildings, the design of buildings and the placement of buildings and the design of cities and the dates of significant events, when wars start and when they finish, when people are apparently assassinated, when royal weddings take place. All of these things are based on occult knowledge, and that we are living in an occult world and we've been trained not to see it. Is that going too far, or is that somewhat accurate?
Oh, it's very accurate. And it's a knowledge that's been used successfully by the elites for thousands and thousands of years. And it has more than we can even imagine. It goes deeper than even people know at this present time. I'm glad to see that a lot of people are now tuning in, especially to the symbolism that you mentioned and the architecture and the various logos and so on. I've been studying it myself for years, and it never stops. It's something that has so many permutations, and it's certainly deliberate on the whole. I mean, there's obviously, you have to be cautious when you take individual circumstances. You have to study individual cases. But in general, the idea that the first principles of using these logos and using the symbolism is a deliberate thing that used to be used by very, very powerful people whose descendants, and this is either ideological descendants or biological descendants, still know the power of that today. Anybody who doubts this is just simply not awake. And they may have been shaken up by recent events, but whether they've been wakened up is, a different matter. So anybody can be shaken up, like 9/11, the whole different sort of movements that have arisen, the alternative research. A lot of people talk about a so-called awakening, and I'm a little bit hesitant to say awakening. I would certainly say that people have been shaken up. Awakening is not just an immediate thing that happens overnight. It's a long process of awakening, you see. So the journey goes on. Each individual must pick up the slack and start investigating for themselves. People like myself pointing them in this or that direction is very helpful, of course. And the knowledge that we provide of our own studies and into these occult matters is important as well. But you see, it's never going to really sink in properly. It's never going to be registered correctly until the individual becomes their own teacher and their own researcher in this field. Why I say that also has a lot to do with the fact that I consider the occult world that you talked about basically part of an individual's spiritual development. The two things are not separate. This is not just some arbitrary subject that people get into. You're not only just studying the power politics situation, you're not just studying the fundamental architecture of control, but you're actually studying something metaphysical in nature as well that has absolutely crucial importance for your own spiritual development.
Okay, well, you mentioned symbols, and I know you've done a lot of work on corporate logos and product logos and things like that. I mean, on one side of the argument, and I've heard this argument, is that, okay, so they're using logos to speak to our subconscious mind, if I understand it correctly, to trigger us, some deep-seated ancient memory within us, to get us to act, whether it's to buy a product or perhaps it's even to vote a particular way, to perform acts or purchase services, and we think that we are making a free will choice. I'm choosing to buy that product. I've done my research and it's my decision, but actually it's bypassing our subconscious, right? Am I on the right track?
Oh yeah. I mean, even scientifically, the people like Bruce Lipton and many other professionals within academia have clearly proven, you know, and I'm including in that the Sigmund Freud's, Carl Jung's, the normal established psychological studies show you that, you know, we're using only a very, very small part of our conscious mind, and this is never forgotten by the world controllers, never. They do very little that appeals to the conscious mind. In fact, even when they're appealing to the conscious mind, it's because, you know, they're focusing on the left hand while we don't see what the right hand is doing. They not only do it for the purpose you just said, which is to stimulate and attract, you know, certain limbic drives or sexual drives, or appeal to the unconscious in those ways, you know, to the father figure, the anima, all of this. They do that. They also do it because they have actually raped us, first and foremost, of our archetypal sort of reservoir, this inherent enfolded template of archetypes that have been built up through millennia, you know, over time, over history, and that has been slowly siphoned off. Man is rootless, racially, culturally, and so on, and therefore. But the trouble with that is, though, that if you keep on doing that, if you keep on impoverishing the mind, well, it works the same way as if you impoverish a person on a material level. If you deny them food, they'll become malnutrited, and it's the same thing with the unconscious. So therefore, they have to set up a dynamic by which, although they've raped us of the sort of original archetypes, they need to then create a situation in which we're being fed, so to speak, you know, externally. And that's where this whole movement of the movies, the logos, the sexy advertisements, and all these other rock videos, and even ad copy and graphics comes in. If it was just selling products, nobody's denying that it is. The merchant just wants to sell whatever he wants to sell, his fur coat or whatever. And of course, it works on that level. But on a much deeper level, these Levi Strausses and, you know, Gucci's and whoever else you can think of are using symbolism that penetrates deeper, and that includes the colors, the type of sounds that they use, the way they use light, and then again the individual symbols that are used.
So this isn't, and the argument I was referring to earlier was that, you know, so what, good on them, they're just clever marketers and they're out to sell a product, and it's why they're so successful. But people who say that just don't get the level of, or the depth, really, of the control that's taking place, and as you said, the rape of our spiritual identity as well.
Well, it's the same thing as, imagine somebody going into a church, grown up all their life a Christian, and then one day they just happen to feel like walking into a synagogue. They're going to feel completely alienated. They're not going to have a faintest idea what that 7-candelabra menorah means, or the Star of David, and the various other symbols that are in that church. If a Jewish person goes into a Christian church, if a Muslim goes into a Christian church, you know, so there's symbols that appeal directly to a group of people, and they take those symbols as having tremendous meaning for them, right? Tremendous meaning. The other guy down the street couldn't care less. It has no meaning whatsoever. It doesn't motivate him emotionally, and so on. So they understand that there are certain archetypal symbols that work on everyone, symbols like the sun and so on. And then you have to sort of go in there and create individual symbols of meaning and power for certain kinds of people, certain kinds, even the male-female dynamic, you know, that red is more attractive to men, green is attractive to women, or whatever it might be. I can't remember exactly which ones it is, but certainly then when it comes across cultural spectrum as well, you have a select symbolism that means something enormous to people that may not mean anything to another person. One of the greatest examples of this was the symbols that were used during the Second World War. You know, one thinks of the Nazis, but of course there's many other examples of this during the Roman era, even before that. So at every era, there's the usage of these symbols because they awaken something strong. and often very positive. It's just that the symbols themselves aren't anything negative or evil or to be worried about. You don't want to be drenched in superstition over any of this stuff. But to realize also that in the symbolism in the hands of these sorcerers is not to help us galvanize ourselves or to uplift our souls. It's to divide humanity and to create tremendous spiritual and psychic unrest.
You mentioned the sun, and the sun is prolific in Illuminati organizations and institutions, corporations. But I'm confused about some of this. I mean, like, the sun is inherently itself not an evil being. But we also hear about the black sun. So I'm confused in terms of who is worshipping what. Is when the sun appears in their symbols, is it the solar sun, or is it the black sun? And if it is, what is it?
Well, it's to do with light. The symbol itself of the sun, and even in the black sun, are chosen because these are the primary symbols in our universe of light. And all deceivers manipulate light. In fact, in the talk that we'll be doing in your country, we're going to go into the question of control, of course, and also how certain dynamics are used. You know, in the sense of everything has a positive and a negative side, and the sun is no different. They use this symbol because light conceals as much as it reveals. Light has certain properties. The very fact that they call themselves the Luciferians, you see, or the Atanists and so on, points this out. And they understand that there's properties of light that the average person probably doesn't understand at all. And one of them is that light, as much as it reveals, it can also conceal, because it can blind you. If somebody's pointing a very bright light in your eyes, you know, you're blinded.
Right.
And light, for all its stimulating values, its stimulation, it gives heat. It can also burn. It can also incinerate. And most importantly, it conceals. And also, it's a very attractive symbol. So these lodges that we're talking about, these kinds of orders, they require members. You have to sort of market yourself. You have to bring in people. And you do that by the promise of power and the promise of hidden knowledge and the promise of light. It's very attractive to think in terms of that. And subliminally, the symbol of the sun has always been associated with some sort of a spiritual enlightenment, illumination, and also material status and power. And so it's very important that they use that symbol. It's instantly recognizable, and it has many occult properties that I've gone into for years trying to explain what those mean. And, you know, and these symbols are both Kabbalistic but also psychological. You know, the sun affects the hormone balance of the body and so on. And it has this religious, of course, it has this great religious concept with the symbols of the halo and the symbols of the aura. So yeah, they're very, very up to speed on these symbols and what they mean. And I would say that some of the most archetypal symbols that affect every human being are, in fact, stellar symbols of the sun, the moon, and various other stars and constellations. Those are the primary ones. Said earlier about some that affect all peoples of all races and nations, right? Well, those are the ones. It's astrotheology that is contains the archive of the most original symbols from which many others have come.
You said also, you just mentioned Lucifer, who we are, I mean, at least with the Christian religion, which is the one I'm most familiar with, although still very ignorant on it, I must admit. Lucifer and Satan are often intertwined as being one and the same. Firstly, are they one and the same? And secondly, if not, or even if they are, who are they?
Well, no, they're not in common. There's nothing in common between those two entities at all. And this is just more claptrap that has come out of the mouths of Christian clerics who know almost nothing about Christianity. I mean, it sounds strange, but and there's various reasons for this, of course. But, you know, even though you have some very knowledgeable people at the top level of the seminaries, people like the Bart Ehrmans and various other people that have, you know, people in the Jesus seminar. It's not that you don't have informed, you know, people who read the ancient, you know, languages and what have you. But I'm telling you, you're not dealing with anybody super intelligent when you're dealing with anyone who believes in religion, first off. I mean, these people can often be crushed to pieces by a simpleton like Richard Dawkins. You know, here we are turning on the TV every day and finding these argy-bargies between the so-called atheists and the so-called religious. This thing's been going on for decades, and neither side has any more brains than the next side. But it's a lovely, you know, muck-slinging, mud wrestling, highly edifying, sort of dialectic that has been set up without a single modicum of intelligence on either side. There'll always be no philosopher sitting there, and if they are, they're only these materialist, nominalistic philosophers. You never get anybody who really knows anything. You know, there's just these two groups always almost like in collusion, you know, secretly, but they love to go back and forth, and never a step forward is taken. So the whole question is that these clergymen and these writers on religion, we don't really need to look to them. You look to these mavericks, you know, and you look to these individuals who've gone so much deeper than these people, making sure that when you understand, if you try to approach a cleric or you try to approach a clergyman, a man of the cloth, and ask him any of these questions, stuff that I deal with every day, God help you. You're not going to get your answers from these people. You're just going to be completely boulderized and given a total nonsensical story, which can easily be proven to be false. And one of them is this concept of that Satan and Lucifer, you know, are one and the same thing. They're not. Lucifer is nothing more than the sun. And it's more than that, of course, actually, but in general, it represents light, the god of light. There's an argument that maybe in a previous time that term was even used for the planet Venus and so on. And in fact, it could have also been that we had a second sun at one time, which has now been destroyed, you see. So it's possible that we could split hairs and say that the term itself referred either to Venus, which it often is thought to represent or refer to, and I'm open to that, or the second sun, you know, which is now destroyed, and then later on it got more generally loosely applied to the son of light, the son of the morning, which is the sun that we know today, Sol, S-O-L. And it represented also in Egyptian world, especially specifically at the time of the pharaoh Akhenaten, they referred to the sun as Aton or Aten, you know, and before that it would have been, you know, Amun-Ra or whoever, you know, Horus or what have you. There are many, many sun gods representing different phases of the sun, different aspects metaphysically of the sun, and also based on which cult was worshipping the sun, they would give it a different name. But the Lucifer being is identical with the god of Akhenaten, not a devil, not an evil presence, nothing of that nature. It was simply the young child of light, you know, the sort of the god of light who rises in the morning and brings light and illumination to all of the world and dispels darkness. And again, who keeps this secret knowledge. If you worship him, you will be always in the light and you'll gain illumination. You'll gain that promissory note, you know, that all these Masonic orders are promising their members. And it's very fascinating study, actually, to even consider what that secret knowledge may be. I've got some vague ideas about what it is. Yeah, and because I've always questioned what would make an ordinary man who's apparently meant to be rational and Western and intelligent, what on earth would make anybody of that nature, you see, want to join one of these lodges? It must be some incredible promise. It must be some, especially on the higher levels. Maybe we shouldn't even bother talking about lower level stuff. But certainly as you go up to the higher levels, what is it then that makes these people so complicit? Why would they do the evil things that they're doing? Why would they take orders? There must be some very, very strong hold on their minds. You know, they must be able to be promised something that they sorely want. And I think it's so basic and to me quite tawdry to just merely say, oh, it's money and worldly power. Well, I think we're way beyond that.
Has the confusion between Lucifer and Satan sort of come down through the ages to modern cults, in the sense of if someone now calls themselves a Luciferian, that they're actually a Satanist, or if someone calls themselves a Luciferian, is it still true to that? Is it still true to being a worshipper of light?
No, because the ones who call themselves Satanists, I actually have a lot of sympathy with them. I'm not a Satanist, but I understand where they're coming from. I look at them as actually extremely ignorant people, but I look at them as I understand where they're coming from. Where they're coming from is because they despise the Christian church.
Is that Satanists or Luciferians?
Satanists.
Okay.
Right. Christianity is created by those Luciferians. Luciferianism can be found in its purest form in Judeo-Christianity, by the way. They're one and the same. That's why I wrote 700 pages in the Irish Origins to try and clarify this. And then even in the introduction of that book, I make the point very, very clearly that anybody who comes from a Christianized background, or even for that matter, religious background, and then tries to write books and point fingers at the so-called hidden cabal of the Illuminati, well, I got a question for you. Do you realize that the island you're standing on is sinking just as much as the island you're pointing at? The very people that you've learned to despise, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't despise them, you shouldn't try to expose them, but with one small clause, they created your religion. So in other words, they've got you by the balls. They've got your mind. They've colonized your mind. It's not impossible that you may, with another part of your mind, say, yeah, down with these overlords. We want to be free, or whatever it might come to your mind. You may be a humanitarian who really desires that. But if you haven't done your homework, then I'm afraid that you are in fact compromised by your very allegiance, because the only individuals who can fight universal tyranny are those who have first and foremost freed themselves from these allegiances and from these basically unsustainable ideologies that have been created by the very force that you're trying to undermine. The Satanist, as I said, is a poor soul who thinks he believes in God. You couldn't believe in his so-called devil if he didn't believe in God. And he has got some rudimentary idea that the Christian church needs to be overthrown. Man's instincts are inhibited because of this, and he toys with the idea that if he does whatever he does, light some black candles, goes make some sacrifices, he can get some sort of hidden or secret occult power. Most of that rubbish that's put out, if we had just a normal conversation in a pub, about what Satanist is, and we drew up 10 lists, a bullet point 10 things of what Satanism is, most of that stuff was created by the Christian clerics themselves. This comes out of the Christian world itself, because they were the ones who detailed what these so-called Satanists are into, their black cats and their rituals and the worshipping the moon and all this stuff. Very little of it has a modicum of truth to it. And then as my studies continued, when I start finding out about the true ritualists, the real sorcery that goes on, it puts this so-called Satan, Sun newspaper, National Enquirer thing, in its perspective, as being kind of almost ridiculous in a way. Because the kind of real Luciferian evil that's going on in the world is so monumentally horrific that it pales into insignificance the sort of Bela Lugosi thing, that we were sort of more familiar with, or which is deliberately thrown up in front of us, especially with these slasher movies and these horror movies, all of which are funded, in my opinion anyway, by the Jesuit order to give us false understandings of evil, false understandings of the nature of animals, false impression about storms and wind and trees and nature, nature being evil, and you better be, watching out for the monster and sprinkle him with some holy water and come back to the church and wave the cross. All of this is a huge thing funded by some very clever people from the Vatican through filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola and others who've got a tremendous allegiance to the Vatican, who are basically agents for the Vatican. And this includes many other directors and producers of movies who would not have the money at all. No way would they have the finances and money to make this rubbish. Consider the Omen movie. Watch that movie with educated eyes. Watch the whole series. Listen to every word. Look at the symbolism. You're going to find out something absolutely incredible about who's making those films and how they interplay between the protagonist and the antagonists. It's absolutely mesmerizing when you see the intelligence. And by the way, they're telling you everything that I'm talking about in the films. The films themselves are giving you the actual facts right there, even Da Vinci Code, other films. Fascinating stuff, leaving us in no doubt what's really going on. For centuries now, the church has realized that it's going to lose members. In fact, it has been. And it's been losing members, Lisa, in countries like Spain, where it's traditionally been very loyal. And yet, because of the change in generations, hundreds of thousands of people are no longer coming to see the Pope. They're no longer paying their dues. They're no longer converting. They're no longer believing. Hundreds of thousands all over the world, let alone in the more Protestant countries, you see, where nobody could give a damn about any of that rubbish. And so they've had to work to scare the bejesus out of people again, because fear and trauma brings people back into the churches. I believe this same force we're talking about was behind the Columbine disasters and many other school shootings and other tragedies, because what happens when a community is thoroughly traumatized? Where do they go? Right back into the churches. Not just the Protestant churches, but the Catholic ones as well.
So these, excuse me, these horrendous practices you're talking about, I'm assuming you're meaning things like the pedophilia and human sacrifice and the other atrocities that we hear about. It's not, is what you're saying that it's not associated necessarily with our common ideas on Satanism, and it's not either associated with our common idea of Luciferianism. It goes way beyond that.
Yes, because you see, at the heart of what's called so-called Satanism, in parentheses, like the sort of Anton LaVey concept, is individualism. And individualism is a very good thing, no matter who's trying to sell it. But in the normal street level sort of Satanistic paradigm, they're trying to get you unlocked, from these idiotic, unsustainable belief systems, because they feel that those are holding back your individualism. Whether this is the case or not is highly, disputable or whatever. But that is part of these ideologies. Whereas on the Luciferian side, they are against individualism with a passion. The collectivism is where the Luciferianism comes in, because the Luciferians, by very definition, are hierarchical beings. In fact, one of their symbols is the beehive, and in fact, one of their other symbols is the 13-level pyramid, with the missing capstone and so on. So hierarchy, regimentation, collectivism, global village—that's where they're at. Whereas on the Satanic side, so-called Satanist types, at least in theory, have an ideology of being alone, being a rebel, being an outsider, doing as thou wilt, trying to find out what you are, and acting in an iconoclastic way. Of course, we all know that those kinds of characters often go too far with that, and then think that they can ride roughshod over the rest of mankind. This is, of course, not the case. This is a false ideology. So that's another very, very, very key point, to bear in mind, that a healthy sense of rebellion, a healthy sense of individualism, I listen to heavy metal. A lot of those guys, appear on the surface to be sort of Satanism or whatever, using the symbols. To me, that's just pantomime stuff. I know that these are very moral people, actually, and that they have a very strong message. They're not members of any satanic societies or anything like that, but it's just that the symbolism, and again, don't forget that the symbolism itself doesn't belong to any particular clique. What we've got to worry about is the institutionalized Luciferian ideologies that have enormous financial power, that are already have built what we know in the West. That goes back even to the architecture and certainly the kind of matrix of legal control. We're talking about very, very powerful organizations that whose evil is just inconceivable, in the sense that, yes, you're right, they do create famines, they do create wars, they do create meltdowns on a national level, and they do abduct and sacrifice children, or at least they have members within their order who have a need to do that, and who do pursue that kind of behavior. Yeah, and worst of all, they try to colonize the human consciousness of the people they believe are their slaves or their servants.
Wow. Okay. It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
Well, I'd say that if you were the average person, TV watcher, I would agree with you that if you don't like Satanism and all the things you'd say against Satanism, if you just change what you don't like about Satanism, and you really knew who you were talking about, like say the average person really understood that there's this Luciferian cabal, everything they'd say would be correct. It's less correct when you focus it on just these little commoner garden Satan types, who have no brain cells at all. And their only concept is, they feel they want to get out of the institution of Christianity. But the criticisms that one might have, I favor that side as well. I have sympathy with them as well. The average Christian gives me a list of 10 points where they don't like Satanism. I know that person, if he only knew about Masonry and he only knew about the Luciferian thing, every criticism that he has would be correct. They're my criticisms as well. But see, this order that we're talking about has expertly divided all people. So therefore, you have a bunch of people over here who just can't stand the institutionalization and will do anything, including becoming Satanists, in order to be free. But I understand that. Then over here, you got another group who'll do anything to conform. I understand that, because the other group has made people feel so insecure that, and psychically raped, as we've talked about, that then that person will do anything to galvanize and wear the same clothes and grow the long beard and wear the right costume and go to the church on the Sunday and read the right books that everybody else is reading, because that person is desperately, desperately psychically infirm and has to have bosses above, bosses below, bosses to the right and bosses to the left in order to feel secure. And then the only thing other than that they want is perhaps to become a boss themselves and boss the hell out of somebody else who allows them to boss them, you see? So the whole thing becomes this unbelievable, chaotic codependency, which is exactly what Big Brother has been planning for thousands of years. They understand these simple truths and know how to work in myriad ways to make people dependent, slave above or slave below. That's how they know how to do it.
Well, astrotheology is another one of the subjects you're very familiar with and talk about. And this is a new subject for me, even although once I got into it, I realised that I was aware of much of the information. I just didn't know it fell under the umbrella with a title of astrotheology. But from what I'm getting from this, the character of Jesus in the Bible is he actually represents all of the constellations as well as individual planets. Is that true?
Well, it depends. Basically, the Jesus that we know from an astrological point of view would be a sun king, a solar hero. You can, in fact, break it down and become more specific. In fact, I would go back to Venus again. Twice, I think Jesus himself is referred to, can you believe this, as Lucifer?
Yes.
And considered identical with the rising sun. Again, pointing to the fact that there's nothing inherently evil about this concept, this word of Lucifer. And it's only because of unbelievably bad scholarship and bad propaganda from the church who latched onto this. Because who are they? They're the people themselves that don't want us going and investigating astrotheology and astrology. So they have demonized the stars. In fact, the whole Bible, as people who've read my work know, is loaded with astrotheology. But officially, they denounce divination studies and what have you. I mean, it's absolutely, once you're actually in the know, it sounds so ridiculous. But this is, of course, what they do, and the average layman goes right along with it. They have no idea that the cross they worship and the halo around Jesus' head and the stars beneath the stars around Mary's head and the serpent underneath her feet represent constellations. And that I can take a person on a walk in a church just down the aisle, and show them all of this symbolism and how incredibly deep it goes. They don't know any of this, and most of them don't even want to know. And so when it comes to Jesus himself, he really represents the sun kings, the sun heroes, in the same way that perhaps Horus and Osiris. And then if you break it down a little bit more and do more homework, then you start seeing, oh, but wait a minute, he's a little bit like Adonis. Or no, wait a minute, he goes into the underworld like Orpheus, or even Tiresias. And then you find out, oh, wait a minute, over here he's doing something else that makes him a little bit more like Balder, the Scandinavian god and what have you, or various other deities that they've borrowed from. So in other words, you end up finding out that he's really a composite. I mean, there's actually 19 Jesuses mentioned in the works of Josephus in the ancient world. All of them had some sort of strong political or religious status, like the sort of messiahs, maybe with a small m. But there's quite a lot of them. And so it was Jesus Christ that the Christians have accepted was basically a composite being, and we can always talk about whether or not it was based on a biographical character. I'm open to that.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you that because I mean, essentially, what's being said through astrotheology is that there never was a human being by the name of Jesus Christ who's historically lived, right? That's going too far, because there is like 19 such characters with that term, a name. It was quite a common name. And then my colleague Ralph Ellis has done amazing work to show that there was actually a historical character. He was a political figure, not a religious messiah, named of Jesus Gamala, and he's written in history. And then Tony Bushby has talked about a character called Yasu ben Pantera, who's mentioned in the Talmud, and was a religious leader, and Judas Chrestus, who's another historical figure. So I tend to like that research. I'm completely okay with the fact that there may have been a biographical character. Mm-hmm. Because you see, even here's the crazy thing about it, is that even Augustus Caesar was known as the Savior. Yeah.
Is
So
it from
hang on,
any of
what
the Rome?
about like with the Da Vinci Code, for example, a work of fiction, but it was based on non-fiction research, and there's been documentaries made and so forth. So people believe they have traced the life of this character of Jesus Christ, that he married Mary Magdalene, that they had children, and that their bloodline exists to this day. So for those people, whose life are they tracing? Who's
Yeah, exactly. That's an interesting question. And Tony Bushby and Ralph Ellis go into that. The Da Vinci book kind of jumps over those two guys. Maybe the author didn't have a clue about their writings, which is more than likely. He's mostly just a footnoting the book, the famous book back in the 1980s called The Holy Blood, Holy Grail. That's where he's just fictionalized that account.
yeah,
And that's a very famous story that is part of what's known as the British Israelite tradition, a tradition that goes back many hundreds of years. Um, its basic idea is that Christ survives the crucifixion, leaves with Lazarus, Joseph of Arimathea, and Mary Magdalene, you see, and arrive at Marseille in France, and basically the districts of the Languedoc, Rennes de la Chateau, and so all these other places, and may have then traveled further up and arrived in Britain. This has always been central to the British Israelite concept. There's a great research that has been done since the 1980s, not by Dan Brown, of course, but by people far more intelligent than him, to sort of give some more bones, some flesh and bones to that story. And the story is still ongoing. Tony Bushby tends to believe that Mary Magdalene married into the Caesars. I can't remember exactly which Caesar, Tiberius or somebody, that her husband was actually Tiberius, and that Jesus was born from their wedlock. And that they also did move westward and arrived in Britain. So he's a believer in that thesis. He thinks he's proved it. And also Ralph Ellis is of the opinion that this Jesus of Gamala character, after being arrested by the Romans, also made his way as a prisoner this time, something more like the man in the iron mask kind of concept, where he was interned in a prison in Cheshire or wherever it was in England. Again, fascinating stuff. Does answer a lot of mythological anecdotes and so on. So I think that, yeah, I have no problem, because as I say, I've listed about maybe 20 different historical figures of whom Christ was based on. One of the most famous being Basilius. This is a famous character from a great sage. He's also known as Apollonius of Tyana. And then the Caesars. I mean, as I was saying, some of the Caesars, including like Augustus Caesar, he went around with a reputation that if you came over and touched his cloth, if you touched his robe, he would heal the sick and all of this kind of thing. So when somebody does their research, they find that there's just umpteen messianic peoples and all sorts of characters like this who said that a new age was going to begin and what have you. But when you go deeper and deeper and deeper, then you get back into this astrotheological archetype, and you start to discover that all these potentates wore the crown. The symbolism was solar, and wanted the halo when their paintings and their murals were painted and created. The stellar symbolism is all around them, including even in the names. A lot of these names, like Isaac, Abraham, Joseph, and what have you, Jacob, Solomon, David, these are not names at all. These are not personal names at all. They were titles that represented either a rank or a status within the solar occult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. So does astrotheology or does astrology tell us why this time, 2011, 2012, is significant? What do you get out of your research, and why?
Well, that's a tremendous subject. It really is. Basically, if you can look at it from the Maya point of view, or you can just dip into normal astrology. I've always likened it to sort of an age of an awakening for several reasons. One is the Maya actually said that, or the prophecy relates to that this is a certain finishing time or conclusion time. I'm not a believer in anything to do with catastrophe. I think that's another dead end. This is often the millennial thing that happens, But the underlying principle of the occult astrology that's connected with our times basically talks about it as an end of a phase of consciousness, an end of a phase of humanity, if you will. And this doesn't bode well, because that end of humanity could literally be that, and then we enter into the age of the machine man. You see, this is my worry, and it's going to be central to the talk that I'm doing down in Australia, that talk, Posthumanism, Age of Manipulation, is part of a series, part of 3 talks. This is the first one, first installment. So it's about this unfolding of this era being not an era of cataclysm in the physical sense, but a cataclysm psychologically, culturally, and of course even theologically, philosophically, and so on, that we are changing what we are in the most core levels of our being, in our levels of understanding, critical ability, judgment, what it really means to be human. And the reason why we are doing that, which these prophecies have said time and time again, is that man is living on the surface of himself, man is a mystery to himself, and primarily man does not want to look at his so-called darker emotions. And even when he does, he has a very negative relationship with those emotions, or perhaps he'll only do it through some sort of surrogate means to look at it, like taking drugs or something like that, in which he opens up these portals of his mind. We had that happen in the 60s, and we have a new cult of it, a new sort of Dionysian cult today, with this ayahuasca nonsense and all the rest of it. So this is inauthentic ways. People give them nice fancy titles and terms, but this is nothing more than another ruse created for, you might as well, it's no more different than the same cult that creates the physical medications, from the FDA, AMA, and the whole of these other leviathans. It's no different. It's just 2 hands serving the same brain.
Well, it sounds like you're saying that this time is significant, but it's one in which the outcome could, you're not sort of saying we're talking about an awakening here where we become spiritually, awake and grow. You think we're actually perhaps devolving?
Well, I don't believe in a we, first of all. So the question needs to be sort of rephrased in a way. I do believe that there will be an awakening for those individuals who have, like, remember we said earlier on about being shaken up, but the waking up process is a personal. So there's no doubt in my mind, I talk to them every day, that there are individuals out there who are deeply passionate about change. They have zero tolerance for the lie. They have the guts to do what is required to continue the journey. Obviously, there's nothing but awakening for them. In fact, their life is one entire, perpetual rite of passage and one perpetual awakening process. However, the other group that might have been shaken up but have no real interest in waking up and who have no interest in doing what we're talking about, the real sacred work, the holy work of looking within themselves for the answers, then those people, and unfortunately they are the masses, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to, in fact, have several reactions to this incoming Plutonic light, if you will, Pluto being, again, a reference to these prophecies, because right now the planet Pluto is very operative in what's going on a social level. And so even though the potential is there for social awakening, so to speak, although Pluto and Uranus, the kind of archetypes that are working today are, again, more about the shake-up. If you really want to be factual about astrology, unfortunately a lot of people are not being factual about it, they're making too broad statements. Those archetypes, those planet archetypes, shake things up. And by shaking things up, they primarily shake up the Saturnian and the Martian and even some of the solar embedded traditional approaches, and perspectives. But what that does is it gives the person then, it's just like sort of been loosening up from your chains, but you don't need to get up out of the prison and walk out. The door may be flung open, an earthquake may have happened and the whole prison is destroyed, but that doesn't still mean you've got up and walk outside the gates to be free. So there's still a little bit of a journey to go, in which the awakening process must continue. Now that, I believe, only happens on an individual level by people who have an innate understanding of where to go to find that information, what to read, who to listen to, and so on, and what to do with it. And then the rest of the people who are sitting there going, tell me what to do. Well, that's not going to create any change. The whole change is about you finding out what you're about in your own individual life. I've said in previous interviews, that consciousness has been left at the door by almost every single person in this alternative movement. Not all, granted, but I would say I can still, even though I might give concession that some people still deal with consciousness, unfortunately they don't deal with the darker aspect of consciousness. So, I'm probably the only one in this movement that not only deals with consciousness per se, but with the darker aspects of consciousness, which is where this is all about. Because we're not going to be whole people unless we understand this whole psychological dynamic of how we don't face ourselves and what we do to avoid facing ourselves. I'm totally aware of what people do to distract themselves and I include in that the religions of the world and the New Age movement and many other things even in this movement. Distraction I'm fully aware of, but I know them as distractions. The individual is not awakened until they themselves embody the Holy Spirit, embody the light in themselves. Don't need it from external sources. And so this growing up period of maturity for individuals, spiritual, psychological maturity, or I've also described it as a sort of psychic sovereignty or psychic immunity, where no pathogentic force can enter your consciousness because you're so strong, based on this martial arts principle that when you yourself are so inherently strong, right, that your enemy can't defeat you, well, then you've won. But fighting the enemy with the tools that they've offered you, and fighting them along with a lot of other people, equally disempowered and misguided as yourself, how could that possibly logically create, change in the world? It never has done, and it never will.
So what do you think of this current global Occupy movement? What do you think that represents, and where do you think that could go?
I don't have any interest in that. I think that these things will, I'm glad to see if they make some topical changes, or maybe on the lower street level, some injustices are corrected. I'm all for that. And it's not that I don't believe in the power of a group. Let's be factual about that. There's certainly enormous power in a group of well-meaning people. But when I speak of people being psychologically infirm or psychologically undeveloped, and that's what I do see. And I've seen it in all the movements of all the world. Never has there been a movement. The one thing about coming together as a crowd is you not only maximize the power to do good, but you also maximize the power to misuse the power. In other words, like William Blake, the English poet, said, that fist that crushes the tyrant's head becomes a tyrant in his stead. So unfortunately, in these movements of change, you find out that the group that takes over and douses one, gives the knockout blow to one form of tyranny, often sets up another kind of tyranny afterwards. And so the person who's really studied these matters has very little faith in these movements at all, because we understand that those well-meaning individuals, if you will, there's been centuries of them. I'm open to the fact that our time might be different in the sense that we have more learning now. Our forefathers, when they rose up with sword and fire, were drastically less educated in the architecture of power than, say, the people today. So I say that the changes that could happen today have one thing that never was in the past, which is learning, understanding of the matrix of power. We're far more up to speed on this than we ever have been in the past, and that gives us great hope. But at the same time, we have to factor in the fact that individuals, if they are themselves alienated within themselves, if they're strangers to themselves on a psychological level, then unfortunately the black sorcery can work its magic again. There's always going to be a Mark II tyranny, because of the individual is not a whole being within inside himself. He's still putting his faith in other people. His life is entirely motivated and changed and affected by what other people say, do, and think, including the society around him, you see. And this is not the way to gain a truly spiritualized, sovereign civilization, which was the plan. That's why we're all here on this planet. We're not just here on this planet to simply be altruistic and create a better mechanistic society, or even a more easygoing sort of society. We're here to spiritually develop, and that can only happen on an individual level. This is the paradox. You may fix everything. You may decorate the world and make it. In fact, isn't that the very motive of the globalists themselves, that they want to make everything safer and cleaner and brighter and longer living and all of that? See, this is the whole thing. The ingredients are the same. So you could live in almost a perfect society and be desperately unhappy inside yourself. Because my focus, I can't talk about others and what they're doing, but the main focus for me is the idea of the psychic immunity of a person being whole within themselves, free within their mind. And therefore, even if that person is living in an utter tyranny, even if they happen to be incarcerated in the dungeon, they're still true, they're still full of light, they're still powerful human beings, you see. Because freedom is purely attitudinal. It will never, ever, at any time in history, ever be granted to you by an external force. No. And unfortunately, people are very affected by that. They really do believe that we just have the right person in power. This is nonsense. Psychologically, this is total suicide. Because there is no right person, and there's no, and even if there was, the moment he gets power, he'll abuse it. This is the message of history. In fact, the true man, right, the man, like the Taoists have always said, the wisest man will never take the power that you're offering him, for that very reason I've said. So you have a paradox here. You have a paradox. And I don't care if you change one father, one overlord, one father figure for another. Yeah, sure, the costume changes continually. But the fact of the matter is, the same dynamics is there. Master above, slave below. But it's not that there's not injustices that need to be fixed. And I myself work as hard as I can to let those injustices be fixed. And I think if those movements are based on great knowledge that, hey, we need to change the legal system. Hey, we got to stop all of these government, machinations. That's a completely different, concept. And I'm behind it 100%. I like to be first in line, But my knowledge of things has gone far deeper than just that. Social change comes with social change comes many other deviant qualities, you see, because again, consciousness itself is being left at the door.
So what are the positive possibilities that we're dealing with in this time?
Well, I think that what's happening now is that we have two roads to go by. The individual, as I said, and you can almost divide the whole human race down the middle based on these paradigms. The individual who simply refuses to take care of their inner anxiety and not do their psychological homework, whether he likes it or not, and no matter how many boxes he ticks and who he votes for and what money he donates and what placards he waves, is heading straight like a sheep into the global village. He will not be able to do anything about it because he is not spiritually raising any flag for the higher force to help him, basically. Mm-hmm. The other individual on the other side, who's existentially empowered, has been doing his homework, understands why he's here on this planet, and that, 30-40% of his energy should go into helping mankind, but the rest of it should be helping himself and making sure he knows what his purpose on this existence is. That individual has unseen forces that come to help him. And it will be those unseen forces that matter a lot. Not that I'm saying like some new ager, just sit back, don't do anything, Flash Gordon's on his way. I don't mean anything like that at all. I mean on the individual level. On the individual is in tune with their oracle, with their higher guide. And that at any time or any season of the world, at any epoch in history, this is what is important for individuals, to have that existential sovereignty and that spiritual center. And to avoid all the forces, you see, that try to compromise that, including the religions, the governments, and any of this nonsense about global diversity and global villages and utopia for everyone and all of this. A lot of these things are very alluring to the masses of mankind. A lot of people who are listening to us right now go, yeah, Michael, I understand you. But unfortunately, we're a minority. Hundreds of millions of people all over the world haven't got even the faintest idea of anything we're talking about and probably wouldn't even like it even if we did explain it to them. So these are individuals, unfortunately, who are going to endorse and are doing it right now. They are buying these memes. They're buying into this nonsense and they're voting for these creatures. And they're going to set up a situation which is infinitely worse than any sort of so-called fascism we've had. People today are not facing their so-called dark side.
So you think the New World Order is alive and well, and we are very much on the verge of implementing it? And is that what you're saying? But it's even it's more than that. It's about who we become as a race as a result.
Yeah.
And as a species, perhaps.
Oh yeah, the species is definitely going through a change, a very, very big one, a very, very big one. Our connection to nature, our connection to our own selves is at an absolute minimum right now. And a lot of the worldly things that take place are to attract us out to the surface again. They're to pull us outwards. And therefore, they know that man, by seeing social unrest, wants to get involved. He is also psychologically running from himself, so he wants to distance himself from his own spirit, his own soul. And the world is the perfect place to do that. He's hiding in the light. He's out there waving placards. Over what? Over the designer chaos that they have created to do precisely that? My work on psychic vampirism, I say, hey, you can always tell a psychic vampirism from one psychic vampire in your life because he or she is the one you're going to, right? Check this out. Talk about a paradox. He or she is the one you're going to rest your head on their breast to gain solace and comfort from the horrors that are besetting you because of their existence. Right? The psychic vampire is the one we go to say, help me, give me comfort, from the disasters that are taking place on my life on all levels, from you being in my life, but me not knowing that. Wonderful. Well, this is how it works on the higher level. These creatures, if we didn't have them, we'd be living completely sustainable lives and have a lot more happiness.
Mm.
They are the ones walking around. These are these specters in the night. These are the predators in the long grass who, while we're not looking, or, sort of as they've distracted us and made us ignorant, go around creating unbelievable turmoil, knowing full well that well-meaning, virtuous people will want to go and do something about it toot sweet. Get in there and fix it, you see, and all of this.
Okay, so your tour that you're about to do here in Australia is called The Architects of Control. And I guess you believe that at this point, we're at a point in time where these architects are about to completely implement their agenda. Is that a correct assumption at this point?
Yeah, exactly. And the talk is named that because it's an investigation of the kind of control that they have, going from the stuff that we're more familiar with into the deepest form of control that they have. And that's my forte, is to show how, first of all, events that happen in even prehistoric days have given them their power. They got their power originally from some place. And the power that they're able to manipulate over the human race. We can't break their control until we know what they know. We got to sort of go into that secret room and read the secret book to find out how did they get their control. I mean, what's going on? And part of that has to do with ancient trauma. I dealt with it in my very first writings back in the times when I did my Atlantis book, and I've been working on it ever since. In that book, I dealt with the question of evil. And so these talks that we're doing now continue that investigation. The investigation into what evil is not a simple matter at all, and takes us into very many fields. And in fact, this tour, this Age of Manipulation tour, is threefold. The first one we're doing, then we do psychic vampirism next, which again looks at the question of evil even in a more deeper way, yet again from a totally different perspective. This time, how it affects even your most individual personal life, and also your relationships that you've had with your parents and your various partners, and even the business workmates and the people in general, you see. So we take it, it's a large thesis, and then there's even a third one after that that'll look at another aspect of it. So I think that you asked earlier about sort of implying whether I'm optimistic or not. The information that I'm dealing with now, I believe personally, that if it is embodied, if people really get their minds around what these studies that I'll be sharing with people, then I believe incredibly radical change will take place. I really do believe that.
Becoming symbol literate, I think was the term you used. Am I true in saying that you think it's one of the most important and first steps that we must make, so that we can
Yes.
we can identify when perhaps we're being triggered, for one?
Yes.
And
definitely.
manipulated. So how does one become symbol literate?
There's various ways. I mean, I've done a lot of work on it to help people along, and now there's a huge research. I mean, after my work came out, people took to it massively, and now you see a lot of things on it. It's just, again, it's very important because it's also, again, part of the spiritual development. As I said, these people manipulate symbols that are really not their own in the first place. I've got a book coming out next year called Trees of Life, and that thesis goes in to show you that almost every symbol that Masonry and religion use originally came from the highest keepers of truth that the planet has ever known, the wisest men, the wisest cults, and that it's been completely corrupted and misused. So by studying symbolism, we take it back. What we're really doing is good people are taking it back. An artist, a painter, a designer, a filmmaker. Now when they're using these symbols and they think, oh, I want to use this symbol, now they're really going to know. If they study my work, they're really going to know why they're using it and what it symbolizes. Or people may have had their favorite paintings or favorite images all their life without even knowing why. So when you study the symbols or even the musical notes, the kind of music they like, or the clothes they kind of wear, or the colors they choose, there's all reasons for this. And so it's very important to know why we like that, where these archetypes come from. And it is very much a first step. That's true. It's actually an ongoing study, like every great study is. But it is the early stages. I had to start doing work on it in public early, because where we are now, I knew that we're never going to get anyone there unless we first, put in some of the basics. And so I started with the symbol literacy. Number one, because it hadn't been done before with any kind of, with any kind of professionalism. That was what worried me. And secondly, because it was necessary, so that once people are up to speed on that, because remember, if you're studying symbolism and talking about it, you can actually get into a lot of other fields from just studying that. It's a very eclectic field. We get into talking about secret societies and satanic orders and all sorts of interesting aspects, psychology, astrology, corporate logos, social injustice. There's so many things that you can visit. TV programs, archetypes. In my DVD on it, we looked at the Star Trek series, and the archetypal, like just the numbers of the figures, the famous archetypal dynamics, and so on. And this helps people if they themselves are going to work on stage or produce plays or even produce movies and productions. You need to know some of these key archetypes. Right down to the look of the individuals, whether they're thin or fat, whether they're short or tall, the colors they wear, all sorts of interesting facets. So studying symbolism goes into many, many interesting things. It includes a study of numerology, sacred geometry. You can't talk about symbolism, without opening a huge, huge, interesting vista of information. And so I thought that would be the most interesting in the beginning for people, and it turned out to be right. They were. And then from that point, you can then go on to modulate it and move out into other subject matter as we've done. And my hope was that it would get to the point where we'd be doing some of the more philosophical, psychological work that I'm doing now, and it's come to pass. So in fact, this Australian tour for me is a very important event, milestone, because of this very fact, that it will be like we did in Architects of Control, the DVD, taking it to the next step and getting even deeper now. I've advertised this myself and mentioned it as a sort of an advanced class in some of the stuff that I've already done in the past, and laid down the foundations. Now we get into the deeper aspects of it, the deeper sort of secrets of it. I think that's going to leave a lot of people at the door. It's not for everyone, I know that, but nevertheless, that's why I'm all right with that, because again, I don't look to large groups and large crowds of people getting into this information. Not at all. It's about select people who are really deadly serious.
So do you think that people need to be familiar with your work specifically in order to come along on this tour and get something out of it? Or do they need, what level of education in what areas do they need in order to be able to walk away from this?
No, they don't need much background for this one, because for the first hour is a recap of the very most important points that I've been dealing with for years now. And also, I think if they want to recap, just watch Architects that Control, the DVD. Everything, that was the first installment, basically, where we're going. So they won't need to watch more than that to have a very, very good grasp of where we're going with this. Maybe a couple of interviews or whatever. But it's not really necessary, because in the first hour, I'm going to be sort of recapitulating. The talk itself is like in about 4 or 5 sections with breaks in between. And the first section is a overview, generally. And in fact, it's more than that. It's got some crucially new things in it as well, by the way, but it has it's mostly going to summarize some of the stuff I've done before. Then we move into a couple of more specific areas in the talk, and then try to get quickly. What I've done, I've tried to be very specific about how this talk is arranged, because I want the bulk of it in time to deal with solutions. And it's not that I haven't had time to do solutions before. I think I've done a marvelous job on that. But the trouble is, it's the venue, it's the actual talk itself. At other talks, when you're not doing it on your own, you barely have a 1 hour, 50 minutes, and perhaps 2 hours to talk. So obviously, right, trying to cram many solutions into like the last half an hour or something like that just is extremely dissatisfactory. And I've done better work, of course, in my DVDs and so on. But and when I now get up on stages, I don't do a lot of public talks, because I have difficulty working with the people who put them on. But the thing is that if, like Adam is a guy of integrity, you want to do it, I'll go ahead. But then I want to make sure, especially now, that the entire day is mine. We don't have to have breaks. Excuse me, I didn't mean have breaks. I mean other people up there, so I can have a long enough time to have a beginning, middle, and end, and then have the extra focus, a larger chunk of time, 3 hours and plus, to really get into solutions, so that nobody can leave the hall without knowing exactly what they need to do. And there's a section on children, which I think is incredibly valuable. I did the talk already. We did it in London and previously in Manchester, and it was mind-boggling. People absolutely loved it, and especially this part on children. We've got that in the solution section. Can't be brushed over quickly. You know, we need the time for that. So the whole thing has been measured nicely. That if we do get that whole, you know, we do something that's all day long, it'll be very good for this to get down to the solutions at the end. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, sure, it's really not important for anyone to have previous. Believe me, this is jam-packed with information. You're going to have more information from this talk than you could want. You know, you wouldn't need to watch other stuff previously. In fact, if you listen to this talk, going back to my previous stuff is even going to make better sense by the people who come to this talk and see it. You know, when they do go back and look at Architects of Control, or even way back to 2006 or whatever, to Origins of Evil and the 2012 Future of Mankind. In fact, almost everything I've done is going to now change in complexion. When people look back at my work, they're going to see what I was doing back then, and they're going to understand more of why those ingredients are in there, you know, at the end when they see.
When you look back, do you see that this was leading to this, or was it leading to this on a conscious level, or you can look back at it and see the evolution of it, of your work?
It's been deliberate from day one. Everything's been an unbelievably methodical and very arduous and long-term process. That's all I can say. I mean, it's just been very. I've taken many professional risks. I've turned down umpteen gigs. I've had to follow the flow and work on things at great effort, taking professional risks, meaning that, you know, one guy likes you out there, that kind of thing. You know, the rest of them couldn't give a monkey's. You know, I've taken those kinds of risks in order to organize what I'm doing in such a way that it not only works for me, but it is moving towards this larger, you know, you cannot have somebody just dive into the depths right away. You've got to teach them in the shallows where it's safe and so on, and introduce these subjects slowly. I've been studying these all my life, but when you come to be in the public eye, and when you come to care about the fact that, you know, people are not up to speed with any of this stuff, they're immensely backward in a lot of this stuff, it's completely new to them, you have to, like a teacher does at the beginning of this season or semester or whatever, is break it down and move from the beginning to the middle to the end. And I'm a lover of articulation. I like a thing to have a beginning, middle, and end. You know, that's what everything in life is all about. I don't care if you're playing an instrument or whatever. There's a natural law, a natural progression of the beginning, middle, and end. And I knew that the theories and the teachings that I want to get to are very complex. I'm not going to chop it up small and make it spinner rack for people in the beginning, like the whole New Age movement has done. I'm not going to do that, because these are beloved subjects of mine. I love the knowledge, and I'm not going to cut it up so that every Joe Schmo can get it. I'm going to deliver it to people who are educated and intelligent and up to speed, and I'm going to do it with some sort of honor to where those ideas come from, right? And that meant starting in the beginning with simpler stuff, moving up, and so that when you finally deliver the main stuff, you do it in a proper serving. You do it with respect, and you don't do it by trying to think that, you know, I need to make this as palatable as possible so that every, you know, zombified person is going to get it. I've never worked in that way, because I think that's completely an immoral way to work. And so I've had to take many professional risks all the way down the line in order to do it this way. But I always knew that it would work, because I know that the time is right, and I know that the psyche of decent moral people want to know the truth, and they're moving up to the aspect now where they know what they don't want, and they know they have zero tolerance for their life. And if that time has come, then so be it.
Well, I look forward to spending a day listening to you talk for 8 hours or so, 9 hours or so. When you do come next month. It's been an absolute pleasure, Michael. And I look forward to catching up with you in person soon when you're here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'd be glad to see you, and again, it'd be lovely to come down to Australia. It'll be my first visit there, so I'm really enthusiastic about being there, you know, and meeting everyone. It's really great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.